This program, Historical Table Preserving Colorado's Bounty, is part of our Insights and In-Person program series, which is hosted by History Colorado's curatorial services and collections access staff. This program series is where we share the stories of people who made and are continuing to make history matter here in our state. And every month we have a program where we bring together historians and history makers to present insights into work, and we love our audience participation and dialogue, so please don't be shy about using that chat box to ask questions or to make comments as we go along. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which I'm giving this presentation. In the spirit of healing and education, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are our partners. We consult with them when we plan exhibits, collect, preserve, and interpret artifacts, do archaeological work, and create educational programs. We recognize these Indigenous people as the original inhabitants of this land. My name is Rachael Beyer. I'm the John W. Emery Family Assistant Curator of Oral History here at History Colorado. And I have more than a decade of professional experience teaching, researching, and collecting oral histories. Perhaps more relevant to today's lecture is that before becoming a historian, I had a prior career working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I'm also a lifelong canner, which is something that I learned from my mom and also from both of my grandmothers, which the confluence of make me particularly interested in the history of food. And I just want to let you know that before we go into our program, I'm going to mention quite a few resources during our program today, and I will send out all of those resources to you after our program today in an email. So anything that I mention, either mentioned in the video or that I mentioned as I go along today, we'll be sending all of those out to you after the program. So to get started, we're going to actually go back to the 1850s. So before the state of Colorado even existed, because we have to talk about a couple of things that happened not in Colorado. In the 1850s, urban centers in our country started to grow pretty quickly, which increased the demand for food that could be transported to the cities and then also still be edible when it got there. And that was a problem. Prior to canning, the primary way that food was preserved was through drying. And so people were looking for alternative options. How could you get things in a fresher or non-dried form? So the first thing that happened was an invention, and that was the mason jar in 1858. And I have a photo here on the left side of the screen that is a mason jar in our collection from that era. It was invented by John Mason, and he invented a technology that could create a glass jar that had a glass lid that screwed onto it. So there's actually on the inside of the lip of the jar, there are threads, and there are corresponding threads on the edge of the lid so that the lid could be screwed onto the jar, which reduced the amount of oxygen touching the food. This was a partial solution because it did reduce that oxygen to the food, but the problem is that the science behind why that happened really wasn't understood. And so very often people would get canned or jarred foods that would be, when they finally did get them open, weren't in great shape. The demand on preserved foods only increased in the 1860s because our country went to war. And as Union soldiers were moving to front lines, the Union Army was trying to find a way to get food to the front lines. And right before the end of the war, a discovery was made. 1864, Louis Pasteur discovered the solution, and that was pasteurization. And pasteurization is the process of treating food with mild heat to eliminate pathogens and to extend shelf life. So with the mason jar as a new invention and the discovery of pasteurization, those two things together indicate the birth of processed food. So what is canning? Well, canning is actually a combination of those two things. It's a combination of pasteurization, sterilizing the food and the container it's in, as well as the technology of the mason jar, which reduces the amount of air touching the food itself. And I've got a couple of pictures from our collection, because once Mason invented his jar and Pasteur made his discovery, very little has actually changed in the process of canning in the last 160 years. So we have some items from our collection that may look very, for those of us who are canners, may look very, very similar to what we still use today. So on the left here, we have a water bath canner. The lid has been removed for the photograph, and it's square. Today, the ones we use are primarily round, although large Amish and Mennonite communities in the Midwest and the East Coast still use square water bath canners because they're much larger than what we use at home. And there was a slight progression in the mason jar technology. And the jar that we have on the right here is the same screw top, screw lid jar that Mason invented. However, what this inventor has done is they've added a rubber gasket to the lip to increase the amount of oxygen, to reduce the amount of oxygen getting into the jar. And then they also have this little metal strap around the edge, which lifts up and over the top of the lid to further tighten the lid's attachment to the jar. And so there was some progress. However, in 1915, the technology that we still use today, which is that little round metal ring that has the gasket attached to it, the disposable ring part, and along with the aluminum screw lid that holds that ring into place, was invented in 1915. And so the technology that we use today is 105 years old and hasn't changed much since then. And so there are two types of canning. In the video, I did water bath canning. I'm talking about water bath here. Water bath canning is used for high acid foods, fruits, tomatoes, foods with added vinegar. Anything you add vinegar to will be a high acid food. Pressure canning is used for low acid foods like vegetables and meat. And we're actually going to talk about pressure canning in just a little bit. Any questions at this point? Haven't seen any come through, but just want to take a second, make sure. Okay.
Why is it called canning and not
jarring? That I'm actually not sure. The process of putting foods into tin cans, the way that we get, most of our canned goods from the store, happened right around this time as well. And so I think that without digging further into actually trying to figure out the exact answer, which I can definitely procure, because it came up at the same time as putting things into metal cans, that it was the same process. And so they didn't change the name of the process because they didn't change the name of the process based on the vessel it went into, because it was the same process putting things into cans as it was putting things into jars. And if that's wrong, I promise I will double check after the presentation and make sure that I correct that if I just gave an incorrect answer. And we'll send that out in the follow-up email just to be sure. And Rachel says her grandmother used to add wax to the top of food. Is that still a proper way to can? Yes, you can still add wax. Some folks do still add wax to the top of their food. The wax is to completely remove oxygen altogether, because the second that you have that top layer of your food and you put that wax layer over the top of it, when that wax solidifies, it will completely seal out the oxygen. Now in today's canning technology, you don't actually need to put in wax, although I have seen it in some artisan type jams and jellies that I've picked up at farmers markets and things, because it has that kind of old fashioned feel to it. But the wax is not actually, is no longer necessary. But it worked great in these screw top jars, because even with the screw top, you're still getting some oxygen in, which is what this jar on the right is trying to further reduce, is like you want no oxygen touching your food. And so the wax helped with that. It's a great question, thank you. All right. So we will move along. I want to talk about what goes into our jars and cans. And that is, in Colorado, that's fruit and veggies. So following Mason's invention and Pasteur's discovery, the number of factories across the United States producing processed foods grew. At the same time, Colorado was increasingly attractive to budding farmers and orchardists who wanted to come here to try growing crops, excuse me. And on all but one account, which I'll get to in the next slide, Colorado was the perfect place to grow fruits and vegetables. We have lovely dry air. We have 300 days plus of sunshine a year. And we have this great fluctuation, which we just saw last week, between super cold nights and really hot days that really appealed to people who were interested in fruits and vegetables, particularly because those conditions combined keep away water-related diseases that often plague orchards in wetter environments. So diseases like downy and powdery mildew, fusarium wilt, and rust, all of those things happen in wetter environments. And so Colorado kind of kept that out. By the 20th century, well after all of our fruit orchards were planted, horticulturalists actually discovered that the high elevation here in Colorado and those big day to night temperature swings actually create sweeter fruit. So the exact same variety of peach or apple or watermelon or cherry that's grown in Colorado versus grown in California or grown in New York are going to actually have a higher sugar content from those from Colorado, which meant that we were producing the sweetest fruit in the nation when we grew our fruit. So in the 1870s, men and women started putting down the first roots and seeds of what would become Palisade peaches and Rocky Ford watermelons and Loveland cherries and even the Pueblo chili. There was one lingering issue though. You probably all know what it is, and that is water. So water is always an issue here in Colorado, trying to figure out how to irrigate those orchards. But so in 1882, as the fruit industry is growing, as commercial canning interests are starting to grow across the United States, a gravity irrigation canal, which moved water by gravity, was built in Grand Valley. And it diverted water from the Colorado River to the mouth of the Tibet Canyon toward Palisade. It worked really well. And so as other people saw that, irrigation canals began to pop up all over our state, and the produce coming out of our state began to gain notoriety. In fact, an 1885 publication in our collection sought to entice orchardists from outside of the state. It included the photo on the left of the screen here where it says, turning on the water. And the text said, well, Colorado is still in her infancy as regards fruit culture. There can be no doubt from the experiments already made that this business will become one of the most important in the state. Fruits grown in Colorado are daily offered for sale in the principal cities and are noted for their size and exceedingly fine flavor. They are preferred to all others and are eagerly sought for by the lovers of such products. And in fact, by 1900, New York restaurants actually ran advertisements saying that they were carrying Colorado peaches and Rocky Ford watermelons. So those things were being shipped all the way to New York City restaurants and were being advertised by the name, their location name. So now we go back to canning. So as the fruit industry boomed, it drew in industrialists from the East who sought to get in on the ground floor of what promised to be a wealthy commercial pursuit, and that was producing canned foods. By locating their canneries near fruit and vegetable producing areas, it would help them reduce their transportation costs to get the fruit and veggies from the field to the cannery. And it would allow them to turn fruit into a year-round market by preserving it and then selling it off season. By 1899, 12 companies had set up shop in the state of Colorado. And about 10 years later, there were 30 canneries that reported a combined sales of more than $1.5 million. Around 3/4 of those canned fruits and vegetables, and the rest of them turned fruits and vegetables into pickles, preserves, and sauces. So if we take our fruit map, which I have here on the screen from 2 slides ago, and we overlap the location of Colorado's canneries, we can see that they're all located in fruit and vegetable growing areas, with Larimer County and the Denver area being having the highest number of canneries during this period. There were 2 really large canning companies of those 30, and one of the names you probably recognize if you buy a lot of canned beans, and that is Max Cooner. Max Cooner opened the Cooner Pickle Factory in Denver in the 1880s, and John Empson opened the Empson Canning Company in Longmont and Brighton in 1899. Now, both Cooner and Empson worked really diligently to expand their enterprises. They built new canneries, they bought out failing ones, and both were quite innovative when they came to trying to make their business successful. So for example, when Empson found that farmers were reluctant to commit the sale of their future harvests to his cannery, he actually became a grower himself. He bought land, he employed farmhands to tend the crops so that he had a guaranteed stream of vegetables coming into his factory. And he found that Brighton's soil was, quote, peculiarly adapted to the raising of vegetables and small fruits. Brighton was also of interest to Cooner, and he opened a pickle factory there in 1910. Eventually, in 1927, the 2 competitors amalgamated, and together they became Colorado's largest producer of processed fruit and vegetable products. Both of them wanted to control as many aspects of the production as they possibly could. So very much like John Rockefeller wanted to control all of the elements of the oil industry, Empson and Cooner were doing the same thing. They really wanted to control everything from start to finish. So we saw that with Empson growing his own crops. And in fact, Empson actually became known as Colorado's pea king, as in sweet peas or field peas. The pea king, because he financially supported the development of technologies to make it easier to harvest and prepare peas. So he oversaw the development of a machine that would mechanically harvest peas in the field, remove them from the pea plants. And he invented another machine called the podder, which replaced human beings for opening and shelling peas to get the peas out of the shell. And his factory became such a model of canning efficiency that it could produce 100,000 cans per day of peas by 1903. And the following year at the St. Louis World's Fair, Empson actually won an award for his canned peas. And Empson wasn't alone. One of Cooner's major products was tomato ketchup. And after a 1911 and 1912 tomato blight disease wiped out large numbers of tomato plants, Cooner actually funded research at what is now Colorado State to try to find out the source of the disease and how to stop it. And the result was actually a method that was used to control fusarium blight, which was the disease that was killing off his tomatoes. And Cooner wanted to share this with people. And so in 1914, he raised 600,000 resistant variety tomatoes and gave the seedlings to his growers without charge so that they wouldn't be plagued by that disease later on in the season. Any questions at this point? Thoughts, comments? Okay. So let's talk about people who did the canning. Canning at the turn of the century was considered a woman's responsibility in the home environment. And it was part of her role in food preparation and preservation. And some of that actually carried over into the canneries. Is that funding, Rachel asks, is that funding where CSU got their foothold in the ag and forest area? That's a great question. So CSU, Colorado State, is a land grant institution. And so it got the funding for land grant institutions comes from the federal government after the Civil War. And land grant institutions were specifically set up to do ag and forestry and animal science research. They're considered agricultural colleges. And so the Cooner funding is not how they got started. However, Colorado State was the obvious choice, would have been the obvious choice for the Cooner family to go to try to do agricultural investigation, because they were already set up as being the resource for agricultural research and solutions. It's a great question, thank you. Okay, so in the canneries, some of that care, so a lot of women worked in canneries. So for example, in 1892, Empson employed 350 to 400 men and women from 10 to 12 hours daily during the peak canning season. Of those 400-ish people, around 100 were girls who had been referred to Empson by the Helping Hand Institute of Denver, which helped young unemployed women find work. And the girls received between $1.40 and $2 a day for their work, which was quite decent at the time. And one newspaper article, a journalist visited the factory, which is shown here on the left in a photo from our archives, and said, the heroine is the 12-year-old girl who hands the empty cans to the man operating the canning machine. She hands him nearly 20,000 cans per day. And as I mentioned, this photo on the left is from our collection of women working in the Brighton facility. And on the right is a more modern photograph of the exact same space, which is from an application that put the cannery on the National Register of Historic Places several years ago. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But I love these side-by-side pics where you have the exact same space and just different times. So I promised I would talk about pressure canning. So here we come back to pressure canning. So commercial canneries in the 19th century, Cooner and Empson's facilities, they processed in high pressure equipment, but the home canner didn't. The home canner used water bath canning. And in the, but in the first decade of the 20th century, several people who made commercial grade pressure canners tinkered with making home models. So here are two pieces from our collection. The piece on the left is a 1909 pressure canner. And the book on the right, the canning book on the right, is the correspondent canning cookbook. Both came, so the canning cookbook would have come along with the pressure canner. This is for the Denver pressure cooker, made by the Pressure Cooker Company of Denver, Colorado. But they were a lot more expensive than water bath canners, and they were way more technical. You have to adjust tensions and gauges and all sorts of other things. And so they really didn't take off with the home canner until 1917. In 1917, the US Department of Agriculture determined that pressure canning was the only safe method of canning low acid food like vegetables and meats without the risk of food poisoning. Well, as you can imagine, that led home canners to start becoming more interested in pressure canners, but the market expanded fairly slowly until 1939, when the pressure cooker, the Presto Canning Company, introduced an aluminum pressure cooker at the World's Fair in New York. And this was a slightly safer canner. It was made of aluminum, so it was less expensive. And all of a sudden, for just a couple of years, pressure canner sales skyrocketed until World War II hit, and all of a sudden there was aluminum rationing and aluminum restrictions, and so Presto had to temporarily halt production of their pressure canner to divert aluminum to the war efforts. But we're going to back up before the war a little bit and look at the Great Depression. And when the Great Depression hit, the local availability of fresh fruit and produce was really fantastic and a boon for Colorado families because of 1934. In 1934, the state brought in the biggest peach crop in its history, 1,804 train carloads. which seems like a lot or maybe not a lot, but it was double the number of peaches from the previous year's crop. So it really, the number of peaches in Colorado doubled in a single year, which made fruit really inexpensive and abundant for those living in the state. And canning recipe books flew off the shelves. A lot of local groups here in Colorado printed their own, such as this Home Canner's Yearbook from 1927, just at the cusp of the Depression, that's on the left here, that's in our collection. And if I'm remembering correctly, was from a women's group in Montrose. The abundance of fruit in Colorado was actually so well known that the Chicago Tribune reported on it. They had an article that said that in addition to what was available at local farmers markets, and I quote here, thrifty housewives in Routt County, Colorado, have found a way to put to useful purpose the wildlife that abounds in the area. Farm women have been busy canning wild fruits. And in 1981, Mary Fiore, who was a Denver resident, who gave an oral history to the Colorado Historical Society, now History Colorado, said that when she was growing up during the Depression, she did a lot of canning. And she said, oh, peaches. You know, in those days, we used to go to the grocery store and they used to have piles and piles of peaches. Now you can't buy anything like that. And when the woman collecting the interview asked her if the quality of fruit was different in 1981 compared to the 1930s, she said that in the 1930s, she said, all this stuff used to come from Palisade and you knew it was Colorado stuff. And she said in 1981, she wasn't quite sure where her peaches were coming from anymore, which changed the quality of them for her. Before I move into World War II, any questions? Yes, I did. So Julie asks, why Colorado produces the sweeter produce, because she missed the reason why. So the reason why is because we're at a high altitude and we also have really wild swings between hot nights and cold days in the summer, hot days and cold nights in the summer, and that the elevation combined with the temperature swing actually increases the amount of sugar in fruit and also in vegetables too. But increases. Great question, thank you. Okay, so World War II. So when World War II came to the Centennial State, the federal government recognized the importance of canning to Colorado families. In fact, sugar was the very first food item rationed in the United States. And however, in 1942, the ration board actually issued separate ration books for canning sugar, not just for sugar, but for canning sugar. And this 1942-1943 ration book in our collection notes 1943 canning sugar to be used for jam and sauce. And despite and our state's also a sugar beet producer industry. We have a large sugar beet industry here in the States that produces sugar. But despite record crops during the war, with the men off fighting, we had a huge shortage of field labor. And Colorado couldn't keep up with the demand at home. And so I have an article in the center of the slide here that actually shows that, that the US increased sugar imports from Cuba by an additional 200,000 tons in 1943. So that any women who wanted, or any women or families who wanted to put up their own fruit by canning it could apply to their local ration board for canning sugar stamps. Now, I mentioned a shortage of labor, field labor. And so because of that shortage, here in Colorado, we had a German prisoner of war camps that, the prisoners worked as agricultural laborers in various areas around the state to offset that, that loss of labor as our men went off to war. And I'd shown you that photo of the Brighton canning facility earlier in the slide, and I said there was a modern slide. And the reason why the Brighton canning factory was nominated and approved to be on the National Register of Historic Places was because in 1945, the cannery itself had actually ceased operations. But the building, because it was closed, was used as a barracks for German prisoners of war in Brighton who lived in what had been the cannery, and then they were picked up on a daily basis to be taken out to the fields to do agricultural work. So the cannery was actually put on the National Register of Historic Places 4 years ago in 2016 through our Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation at History Colorado. And it's one of only 14 canneries in the entire United States that's on the National Register. German POWs weren't the only people providing agricultural labor for our canning industry during World War II. And another solution that the federal government had fixed upon a few years earlier in 1942 was a program called the Bracero Program. And the Bracero Program was an agreement between Mexico and the United States, which opened borders in 1942 and became a law in 1951. And the program provided provisions for wages, room and board, transportation, and an anti-discrimination clause for Mexican laborers coming here to work in our fields. However, communities in agricultural areas did not always have open arms nor adhere to those labor rights. So on the western slope, the Palisade Migrant Labor Camp, shown here on the right, had 200 cabins, which during an inspection by federal agencies were noted as being unsanitary quarters, which appeared to be one long spell of privation and misery. In response to that review, a collective of growers' wives, along with the Palisade Women's Club, led a grassroots movement to change the substandard living conditions. And Chuck Howe, who was one of the Cooner canning family members, was a child growing up around the men, women, and children living in, working in the Bracero program. And he remembered of those people, he said, those largely unseen people were the migrant pickers who performed the back-breaking labor required to move the produce from the ground so that it could be canned, laboring long hours outside in harsh conditions and with few amenities. So I just like to just take a moment to think about the people who were bringing those things in from the field as well. So before we talk about decline, any questions at this point? Okay, if you do, pop them in there. So canning hit a decline. By the 1950s, middle-class Americans had largely recovered economically from World War II, and home canning began to decline. This was in conjunction with a rising demand for convenience and prepackaged foods. And also middle-class women started working outside of the home sometimes, even part-time, which meant that they had little time for home canning. And so here I actually included a photograph from our collection of a woman named Eleanor Valdez, who owned an Italian restaurant, and her restaurant actually began making prepackaged ravioli to be frozen and sold in supermarkets around the Denver metro area. And so these kind of prepackaged foods were replacing home canning. Colorado's commercial canneries saw a decline as well, as they found that although irrigated, but still often dry fields, were competing against the year-round warmth of California and the rich soil of the Midwest. So by 1960, Cooner Empson sold the majority of their stock to Stokely Van Camp, which was a Midwestern company. And Stokely Van Camp ended up selling the now shortened Cooner from Cooner Empson to Faribault Foods of Minnesota. So that's where Cooner is, the Cooner is now owned by Faribault Foods of Minnesota, but we still have our Cooner beans on the shelf. So they're still around today in some form. So we have a decline in the 1950s, but by the 1990s, we start to see a rebirth in both home and commercial canning. From a number of things converging together. So I'm just going to share a few of those things that converged that have been growing over the last 10 or 20 years in some cases. So first of all, there was a desire to better regulate one's diet for health. Vegetarianism and veganism began to gain popularity. At the same time, some Coloradans started thinking more earnestly about what sorts of chemicals they were using on their foods, and the organic movement grew, as did community and urban gardening. Another movement was that of slow food, which asked Coloradans to counter the fast food mentality by slowing down the preparation, consumption, and enjoyment of food. Some chefs in restaurants began to try to source their produce as local as possible, which ended up becoming what we now call localvore, which is, eat the food that comes close from you. And as well as the rise of horticulture therapy, which is the idea that working with plants and gardening improves the health of mind, body, and soul. This rebirth of the canning industry in Colorado has been supported for the last 21 years by the Colorado Department of Agriculture's program, Colorado Proud. And Colorado Proud is a buy local campaign that helps Coloradans get their produce from farming and ranching neighbors. And the program has more than 2,700 members, which include growers and buyers, such as restaurants or schools, from across the state. And so many supermarkets, you'll see this symbol, Colorado Proud. You can find these foods in grocery stores and farmers markets, local restaurants, and you can buy into them with CSAs, which are community-supported agriculture organizations. We've also seen those same ideas spark imagination in our local small business entrepreneurs. And they respond with an idea that actually drew on a Great Depression concept of the community cannery. The community cannery has, in the 21st century, been turned into what is now called a co-packing facility. And co-packing facilities provide all the nuts and bolts that are needed for small businesses to can. They provide health department licensed kitchen space, processing equipment, employees, to be able to preserve various types of canned, jarred, or bottled food products. And these co-packer facilities are really great here in Colorado because they democratize access, they reduce startup costs, and they satisfy a lot of those consumer needs that we talked about on the last slide. And the co-pack directory, which I'll share in the resources at the end, is a great place to actually find local businesses because the directory tells you who uses the co-packing facilities. And then you can look at the list backwards and see who produces their things locally here in Colorado. Now, if you want to learn more about canning itself, the only place I'm going to recommend is Colorado State University's Extension Office. Their county extension offices around the state offer classes on how to preserve and process foods at home. Most of them are online right now, so even if you don't live local, you could take a county class somewhere in the state. And additionally, CSU has a really great free app, which I briefly mentioned in the video, called Preserve Smart. And it's exactly what we need here in the state of Colorado because altitude changes the amount of time you need to process your foods. And the amount of processing time is critical for producing safe food. And so this Preserve Smart app, when you open it, actually asks for your altitude. And then it gives you an option to look through fruit and vegetable recipes by fruit or vegetable type. So you don't have to do any of the math in trying to figure out how long you need to process your product. All you have to do is plug in your altitude and the recipe will automatically adjust to where you are. So it's a really, really great app. So I strongly recommend CSU as really your only source because we are talking about food safety. We don't want to have, nobody wants to have botulism because they accidentally can something wrong. So I strongly recommend them as being our go-to resource for canning. Finally, to quote from the bumper sticker on my car, I eat local because I can. So far this growing season, I've canned peach butter and peach chutney with peaches that I got from the Palisade Peach Shack. I've also canned green beans, roasted red peppers, sweet pickles and dill pickles and pepper jam and watermelon rind pickles, all of which I get from my local farm family, Miller Farms. They grow outside of Longmont and I see them at my farmer's market every single week. So I know I don't think there's anybody from Miller Farms on today because they're busy bringing things in from the field right now. But I just have to say a shout out to them because I get all my amazing produce from them. So canning is really a great way to be able to enjoy Colorado's bounty year round. We get to enjoy doing hot kitchen canning in the summer to make it very worthwhile in the winter when we get to enjoy our fresh produce.